The prairie stretched endlessly beneath the setting sun, a golden sea of grass swaying in the wind. Dust rose in slow spirals as wagons rattled along the trail, carrying weary settlers toward what they hoped would be safer ground. Among them rode Clara Monroe, her hands tightly gripping the reins of her mare, her heart heavier than the trunk of belongings strapped to the wagon behind her. Clara was not yet 20, but life on the frontier had aged her. Her family had left Missouri 3 years earlier, chasing land and promise in the West. Yet promise quickly soured into hardship. Crops failed, raiders struck, and neighbors whispered of wars breaking out between settlers and the Apache. The frontier, she had learned, was not a land of milk and honey. It was a place where survival was bartered with blood. Her father, Samuel Monroe, was a man of stubborn will. A man must make peace or bury his kin, he often said. And when whispers of an alliance reached his ears, an arrangement with a neighboring Apache band, he had seen it as salvation. But the price of that salvation was Clara herself. The terms were clear. The Apaches would cease raids on Monroe land, and in return, Clara would be given in marriage to one of their warriors, a man named Tahu. When her father told her, Clara thought the world had ended. "Marry an Apache?" she cried, the words tumbling out like stones. "I don't even know him." But her protest fell against a wall of resolve. To Samuel, it was not a question of want. It was a question of survival. On the day of her wedding, Clara's reflection in the cracked mirror startled her. The white dress, patched and yellowed from years in a trunk, seemed like a ghost of another life. Her dark hair was braided with wildflowers by her younger sister, who wept quietly as though mourning a funeral. Clara's hands shook as she tied the ribbon at her waist. The ceremony itself was stark, performed on the open prairie where both families gathered. On one side stood her kin, dusty, thin, eyes heavy with worry. On the other stood the Apaches, proud and solemn, feathers glinting in the sunlight, eyes sharp as hawks. Tahu stood among them, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark gaze unreadable. Clara barely lifted her eyes to meet him as words were spoken, as vows were exchanged. She felt as if she were being traded like cattle, her fate sealed with every murmur of agreement between her father and the Apache chief. When it was done, Tahu stepped forward and offered her his hand. She hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers into his palm. His hand was warm, firm, steady, so unlike her own. That evening, the settlers returned to their wagons, and the Apaches rode with Tahu and Clara toward their camp in the foothills. Clara looked back only once, seeing her family fade into the horizon, their figures small against the vast, merciless sky. She felt abandoned, exiled, a prisoner of peace. The Apache village sat nestled in a valley where the river bent and cottonwoods lined the banks. Smoke curled from fires, children darted between lodges, and women worked with practiced ease. The sight filled Clara with dread. She was an outsider here, a foreigner among a people she barely understood. Every glance seemed to pierce her. Every whisper felt like judgment. That night, Tahu led her to a lodge at the edge of the camp. It was simple but sturdy, with furs spread neatly across the floor and a small fire glowing at its center. Clara stood frozen at the threshold, clutching her shawl as if it could shield her from what was to come. Tahu spoke little, his voice low and measured. He gestured for her to sit, offering food, corn cakes and roasted venison. Clara shook her head, her throat too tight to swallow. Silence hung between them, broken only by the crackle of flames. When the time came, her fear rose like a storm. This was her wedding night, but it felt nothing like the stories she had heard whispered among girls back home. She expected roughness, dominance, perhaps even cruelty. Her hands trembled as she clutched her shawl tighter, waiting. Tahu approached slowly, his movements calm, deliberate. He knelt beside her, his dark eyes studying her face. Then in a voice softer than the wind that stirred the lodge walls, he whispered, "I'll be gentle." The words struck her harder than any demand could have. She blinked, uncertain if she had heard correctly. His tone carried no force, no impatience, only reassurance. For the first time since the bargain had been made, Clara felt a flicker of something unexpected. Safety. He did not touch her immediately. Instead, he sat beside her, his presence steady, unthreatening. He spoke a few words in English, halting but clear, telling her she need not fear him. Clara's heart pounded, but slowly the storm inside her quieted. The man she had imagined, a fierce savage from the tales settlers told, was not the man before her. This man was patient, careful, almost tender. That night, Clara lay awake long after the fire had burned low, listening to the sound of his breathing beside her. She stared at the lodge ceiling, her thoughts tangled. She was still afraid, still uncertain, but the words he had whispered echoed in her mind, soothing her like a balm. "I'll be gentle." Perhaps, she thought, this forced union was not the end of her life. Perhaps it was the beginning of something she had yet to understand. The fire in the small lodge burned low, its glow casting amber shadows across the fur-lined walls. Outside, the night air carried the distant sounds of drumming and soft singing from the Apache camp, a celebration that seemed a world away from the quiet chamber where Clara Monroe sat, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Her heart had not yet settled from the words Tahu had spoken. "I'll be gentle." She replayed them again and again, each repetition softening the fear that clung to her ribs like thorns. He had not pressed her, had not reached for her as she had dreaded. Instead, he had let her breathe, given her space. It confused her almost as much as it relieved her. This was her husband now, a stranger bound to her by the will of her father and the demands of peace. She had expected to be treated like property. Instead, she was being treated as though her feelings mattered. Tahu sat across the fire, his figure steady, silent. His hair, long and dark, caught the flicker of flame. His gaze was not fixed on her, but on the fire, as though he too carried a weight he did not show. Clara studied him carefully, searching for the man behind the quiet. Finally, he rose and moved to a small woven basket at the edge of the lodge. From it, he pulled a carved wooden bowl and poured water into it. Then he dipped a strip of cloth and handed it to her, gesturing toward her hands. She hesitated, unsure, but he nodded gently. Clara obeyed, letting the cool dampness wipe away the dust of travel from her palms and wrists. When she returned the cloth, he took it and repeated the gesture for himself, cleansing with deliberate patience. It was not merely an act of practicality. It felt ceremonial, as though they were shedding the remnants of the day, entering the night as two people bound by something fragile and new. "Eat," he said softly, his accent shaping the word. He placed roasted corn and venison between them. Clara's stomach tightened. She had eaten little since morning, yet pride and fear made her resist. Still, the hunger gnawed at her. When she finally reached for a piece, she felt his eyes on her, watching without judgment. He waited until she had eaten before taking some for himself. In that small act, Clara saw something she had never expected: courtesy. Back home, meals had been loud affairs, men eating first while women scrambled to serve. Here, this warrior waited until she was fed before taking his own share. It unsettled her, reshaping the image she had carried of him. When the food was gone and silence returned, Clara braced herself for what would come. Her heart pounded as she lay down on the furs, pulling her shawl close. She expected him to approach, to claim what the vows had bound. Instead, he remained where he was, his eyes lingering on the fire until finally he stretched out on the opposite side of the lodge. The distance between them felt like a canyon, wide and echoing. She dared to peek at him, half expecting him to rise at any moment, but he did not move. His breathing grew slow even, confusion tangled with relief. Was this restraint, respect, or something else entirely? Clara's thoughts drifted back to her childhood, stories whispered by firesides of raids and violence, tales that painted Apache warriors as ruthless, merciless. She had believed them, feared them. Yet here she was, lying beside one, and he had done nothing but show patience. Her eyes burned with tears she could not explain. Was it grief for the life she had lost? Gratitude for the kindness she had not expected? Or fear that the peace she felt now was only temporary? Sleep came in broken fragments. At one point she stirred and found him watching her. Their eyes met across the fire. She tensed, clutching her shawl tighter, but then he spoke again, low and steady. "You are safe." The words were simple, but they fell over her like a blanket. Clara swallowed, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to trust, but trust was not born in a single night. It grew like roots seeking water in dry earth. Still, as she closed her eyes again, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, his promise might be true. Morning came with the cry of a hawk circling above the valley. Light filtered through the lodge walls, golden and warm. Clara awoke to the sound of movement, Tahu already risen, tending to the fire. He glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable, then stepped outside. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from the unfamiliar bedding. For the first time since leaving her family behind, she felt the faintest flicker of calm. Nothing had happened. Nothing had been forced upon her. She was still herself, still whole, and yet something within her had shifted. She was no longer merely a girl traded for peace. She was a wife, bound to a man who had chosen restraint over conquest, gentleness over power. Her mind was a storm of questions. Who was this man truly? Did his kindness hide something darker, or was it genuine? A truth deeper than the stories she had been told all her life. As she stepped outside the lodge, the camp bustled with life. Children chased one another. Women carried baskets of water. Men prepared for the day's hunt. For a moment she stood in the doorway, an outsider on the threshold of a new world. Some eyes turned toward her, curious, assessing. She wrapped her shawl tighter, feeling exposed. Then she saw him, Tahu, speaking with two other men, his stance calm but commanding. He glanced back toward her, their eyes meeting briefly. He did not beckon her, did not order her. Instead, he gave a small nod as though to say, "You belong here if you choose to." Clara's heart twisted. She did not yet know what belonging meant in this place, nor what her future would hold. But she carried with her the memory of his whisper, the steadiness of his gaze, the promise of safety. The first night had not been what she feared. It had been something else entirely, a quiet crossing, a fragile beginning. And as the sun rose over the valley, Clara Monroe realized that her story was not over. It was only just beginning. The days after Clara's first night in the Apache camp were filled with silence, observation, and the steady rhythm of survival. Life in the valley unfolded with an order she did not yet understand. Women rose early, tending fires and preparing food. Men sharpened their weapons, rode out for hunts, or returned with game slung across their shoulders. Children laughed and ran barefoot in the dust, their joy as free as the river that wound through the cottonwoods. Clara, however, remained on the edges. She felt eyes upon her wherever she went, whispers that she could not understand. Some of the women glanced at her with open curiosity, others with guarded suspicion. She was not one of them. Her pale skin, her settler dress, her halting steps all marked her as foreign. Tahu did not push her into the circle of camp life. Instead, he let her watch, let her learn at her own pace. When he returned from hunts, he offered her a share of meat before he ate. When he drank from the river, he always filled her cup first. These small gestures, repeated day after day, began to soften the tightness in her chest. One morning, Clara ventured beyond the lodge to where women were grinding maize on flat stones. Their hands moved rhythmically, turning kernels into fine meal. The steady scrape echoed through the air, and Clara lingered nearby, curious. An older woman looked up, her face lined with years, and after a long pause, she patted the stone beside her. Clara hesitated, then sat. She mimicked the woman's movements, awkward at first, but the woman gave a faint smile and guided her hands. By the time Tahu returned that evening, Clara's skirts were dusted with maize, her arms aching, but her heart lighter. She had been included, if only for an hour. That night she waited until he had set aside his bow and sat by the fire. "I tried," she whispered, unsure if he would understand. She rubbed her hands together, miming the grinding motion. His lips curved faintly, a rare smile flickering across his face. He nodded, saying a single word in his language, one she did not know but felt. It was approval, recognition. Her chest warmed with pride. As summer deepened, Tahu began to show her pieces of his world. One evening he led her to the riverbank. He handed her a small fishing spear, its point sharp and gleaming. Demonstrating with ease, he waded into the shallows, his movements patient and precise. With a swift motion, he speared a fish, lifting it with a quiet grin. Clara laughed for the first time since her arrival, a sound that startled her as much as it pleased him. When she tried, her first attempts failed miserably. Water splashed her skirts, and the fish darted away faster than she could strike. But Tahu never mocked her. He guided her stance, adjusted her grip, and when at last she caught a small silvery trout, he clapped her shoulder gently. She carried that fish back to camp as though it were a prize, her smile lingering long into the night. It was not only tasks he shared with her, but words. Slowly, patiently, Tahu began to teach her phrases of his language. He would point to the sky and say the Apache word for moon, then wait for her to repeat it. Sometimes her tongue stumbled, earning a rare chuckle from him. Other times, her pronunciation drew an approving nod. In return, she offered English words, teaching him river, tree, home. Their exchanges were halting, often broken with laughter, but each new word was a thread weaving them closer together. One evening, as the fire glowed low, Clara dared to ask, "Why me?" He was silent for a long while, as though searching for words in her language. Finally he said, "Peace, your father, my people." His hand rested on his chest. "But," he hesitated, then met her eyes. "Now you." Her breath caught. The meaning was not fully clear, but the way his gaze held hers told her enough. He had not chosen her in the beginning, perhaps, but now she was more than a bargain to him. Not all was easy. Some in the tribe still looked at her with doubt. A group of young women whispered when she passed, their laughter sharp as knives. Once a boy threw a pebble at her back when he thought she would not notice. Clara felt the sting of rejection keenly, retreating to the lodge in tears. That evening, Tahu found her silent, staring at the ground. He crouched beside her, lifting her chin gently. She shook her head, trying to hide her hurt. But he understood. He touched his chest again, then pointed to her heart. "Strong," he said. Then in halting English he added, "Not weak." It was not a lecture, not a dismissal of her pain, but a reminder. She was stronger than she believed. And with him beside her, she could endure. As the weeks turned to months, Clara discovered a rhythm of life she had never known. The nights no longer brought dread, but quiet companionship. She and Tahu sat by the fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, yet the silence was no longer empty. It was shared. One evening, as summer's heat gave way to the cool breath of autumn, Tahu returned late from a hunt. Clara had fallen asleep near the fire, her hair unbound, her face softened in slumber. He paused in the doorway of the lodge, watching her. Something in his chest stirred, a tenderness he had not expected, a bond that had grown quietly day by day. Clara stirred awake and saw him there. For once she did not startle. She only whispered, "You're back." He crossed the room, set aside his bow, and sat beside her. His hand brushed against hers, light as a feather. She did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled against his, uncertain but willing. In that simple touch lay the truth neither of them could deny. The bond had taken root. What had begun in fear and duty was slowly becoming something more. Clara no longer saw Tahu as a stranger, nor as the enemy her people had feared. She saw him as the man who waited until she had eaten, who taught her to fish, who spoke to her in 2 languages, who treated her with a gentleness that belied his warrior's strength. And for the first time since the marriage vows were spoken, Clara felt the stirring of something she had never expected. Hope. The valley had grown familiar to Clara. She no longer woke each morning wondering where she was, no longer counted the days since she had left her family behind. Instead, she rose with the sound of the river, the smell of wood smoke, the voices of children greeting the dawn. Her hands had grown steady at grinding maize, weaving reeds, fetching water. Though she was not fully part of the Apache camp, she no longer felt like an intruder. But belonging, she soon learned, was a fragile thing. Whispers still followed her. Some women watched her with wary eyes, as though she were a fox prowling too near the hens. Others openly muttered when she tried to help, their words sharp in a language she only half understood. Clara bore it in silence, swallowing her hurt, yet she knew she could not ignore it forever. The first trial came quietly, like a storm on the horizon. It was during a communal meal, when hunters returned with deer and the tribe gathered to share. Clara had helped prepare the meat, her hands slick with smoke and grease. She carried a platter toward the fire when a young woman, eyes flashing with jealousy, stepped into her path. "You should not serve," the woman said in halting English, her voice hard. "You are not one of us." The words struck like a blow. Around them, conversation stilled. Clara froze, clutching the platter, heat rising in her cheeks. She wanted to vanish, to sink into the earth. Before she could retreat, Tahu rose from his seat. His voice cut through the silence, low and firm, as he addressed the woman in Apache. Clara did not understand the words, but she understood the tone, unyielding, protective. When he finished, he took the platter from Clara's trembling hands and set it proudly before the fire himself. The murmurs resumed, but different now, less sharp, more subdued. Clara sat down, her heart pounding. She glanced at Tahu, who met her eyes with quiet assurance. His defense had been more than words. It was a claim, a declaration. That night, as they sat by the fire in their lodge, Clara whispered, "They do not want me here." Tahu looked at her steadily. "Some do not," he admitted. Then, placing a hand over his chest, he said, "I want." The simplicity of his words undid her. She blinked back tears, realizing that even if the whole camp turned against her, he stood with her, and that was enough, for now. The second trial came not from within the tribe, but from her own blood. Weeks later, a group of settlers rode into the valley under a flag of truce. Dust coated their clothes, rifles gleamed at their sides. Clara's heart leapt when she recognized her father among them, his face weathered but fierce. He stared at her as though seeing a ghost. "Clara," he breathed, stepping forward. "Thank God you're alive." Emotion surged in her chest. She wanted to run to him, to feel his arms around her, but she hesitated, caught between two worlds. Tahu stood beside her, silent, his presence steady but tense. Her father's eyes hardened as they shifted to Tahu. "Is he treating you well?" Clara swallowed. "Yes, Pa, he's been kind." "Kind?" Samuel spat. "He stole you, Clara. This isn't a marriage, it's captivity." His words burned, but she shook her head. "No, it was your bargain, Pa. You gave me to him." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Her father's jaw clenched, his shame plain. "I did what I had to for our people. But I never meant for you to stay. Come back with us now. You don't belong here." Clara's chest ached. The thought of home tugged at her heart. The sight of her sister, the sound of the old piano, the smell of bread baking in the iron stove. But when she glanced at Tahu, she saw more than a husband bound by duty. She saw the man who had defended her, taught her, waited for her trust. "I do belong," she said softly, surprising even herself. "Here, with him." Her father's face twisted with disbelief, then fury. "You've been fooled, Clara. You'll regret this." Tahu stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm. He spoke to Samuel in measured English. "She is my wife. She stays by her choice." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "You'll never be part of us again," he warned Clara, his voice like ice. Her throat tightened, but she lifted her chin. "Then I'll build my life here." The settlers left soon after, their horses kicking up dust that stung her eyes. She stood watching until they vanished beyond the hills, her chest hollow yet strangely lighter. For the first time she had chosen her place, not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of her own will. Still, acceptance in the tribe was not easily won. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a band of raiders from another Apache group descended near the valley. Tahu and several warriors rode out to drive them away. Clara waited in the lodge, heart pounding with fear. She had lived through raids before, had seen blood spill on both sides. The memory of neighbors lying lifeless in Missouri fields haunted her. When Tahu returned hours later, his arm bore a deep cut. Clara rushed to him without thinking, pressing a cloth to the wound. Her hands shook, her breath ragged, but she worked with determination. He winced at the sting, but did not pull away. Others watched from the doorway, their eyes widening at the sight. A settler woman tending an Apache warrior as though he were her own. It was not a scene they had expected. Some whispered, but their tone had shifted. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was recognition. She cared for him not because she was forced, but because she wanted to. Word spread quickly. By the next morning, an elder woman came to Clara with herbs for healing. Another offered to show her how to weave stronger cloth. Small gestures, tentative but genuine, began to replace the cold stares. Clara realized then that trust was not given. It was earned, slowly, through choices and actions. As autumn deepened, Clara and Tahu walked one evening to the ridge overlooking the valley. The world stretched wide before them, painted gold by the setting sun. Clara breathed deeply, the air crisp, carrying the scent of pine. "This place," she whispered, "feels like home." Tahu looked at her, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "Home," he repeated, the English word smooth on his tongue. He reached for her hand and she gave it willingly. Clara knew the trials were not over. There would be more whispers, more doubts, more moments of pain. But she also knew this. They had faced the storm together and had not broken. The world might not yet accept their union, but within the quiet strength of their bond, Clara found something she had never expected: peace. And peace, she realized, was its own kind of love. Winter came early to the valley. Frost silvered the grass at dawn, and smoke from the lodges rose in pale columns against the gray sky. Clara wrapped herself in a fur-lined shawl, her breath misting as she stepped outside each morning. She had lived through winters on the frontier before, but this one was different. This one she faced not as a daughter bound by her father's will, but as a wife standing beside Tahu. The changes within her were quiet, but profound. She no longer counted herself as outsider. The tribe had begun to accept her, if not fully, then cautiously. The old woman who once avoided her now shared herbs for teas. The children no longer ran from her but played near her skirts, laughing as she mimicked their games. Even the young women who had mocked her now greeted her with polite nods. But the greatest change was within her own heart. What had begun as fear had grown into something tender, steady, and deep. Each day with Tahu revealed another piece of the man behind the warrior's mask. His patience, his quiet humor, his fierce loyalty to those he loved. One evening, as snow fell softly over the valley, Clara sat by the fire in their lodge, mending a tear in Tahu's shirt. He returned from the hunt, his hair damp with melted flakes, his arms burdened with meat. When he saw her bent over his clothing, his brows lifted slightly. "You mend?" he asked in his careful English. She smiled faintly. "Of course. Can't have you walking around looking ragged." He chuckled, a sound so rare and warm it filled the lodge. He sat beside her, watching her stitch with precise fingers. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was full, rich with the quiet comfort of two lives entwined. When she finished, he took the shirt, ran a hand over the neat seam, then touched her hand gently. "Good wife," he said, his voice low. Clara's heart tightened. She had never thought she could hear those words, spoken with such sincerity from a man she once feared. Her throat ached, but she managed a smile. "And you're a good husband." The winter deepened, bringing storms that rattled the lodges and blanketed the valley in white. Food grew scarce, but Tahu always made sure Clara ate before he did. Sometimes when the nights were bitter cold, he wrapped his blanket around both of them, his warmth steady against her. It was during one of these nights, as the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, that Clara realized the truth. She loved him. It struck her suddenly like the flare of a lantern in darkness. Love, not duty, not survival, not gratitude, but love. It was in the way her heart quickened when he returned from the hunt, the way she trusted his hand on hers, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. She lay awake long after he slept, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. She had never imagined this life, never believed such a bond could grow from fear. Yet here it was, strong as the roots of the cottonwoods that lined the river. The next morning she rose early and began to prepare food, her hands moving with unusual care. When Tahu awoke, he watched her for a moment, then asked, "Why smile?" Clara turned, her cheeks flushed. For a moment words failed her. Finally, she whispered, "Because I'm happy." The simplicity of her answer seemed to strike him. His expression softened and he reached for her hand. "Me too," he said, his voice quiet but firm. But love was not without its trials. In the early spring, word came that settlers had attacked a distant band of Apaches, burning lodges and scattering families. Tensions rose and voices in the camp grew sharp. Some argued that Clara was a danger, a spy among them. Others whispered that her presence brought misfortune. Clara felt the weight of their suspicion again, heavier now than before. She feared she might lose the fragile place she had carved. But Tahu stood firm. One night before the council fire, he rose to speak. His voice carried with strength as he defended her, not as a bargain, not as an outsider, but as his wife. Clara stood beside him, trembling, but his presence anchored her. When he finished, silence hung over the circle. Then slowly an elder nodded. "She has chosen, and he has chosen. That is enough." The murmur of agreement spread, soft but resolute. Clara felt her knees weaken with relief. For the first time, the tribe had accepted her, not because of her father's bargain, but because of the bond she and Tahu had forged with their own hands, their own hearts. The seasons turned again. Spring brought blossoms to the valley. Summer brought warmth and plenty. With each passing day, Clara's love for Tahu deepened. She found joy in the smallest things, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the steady strength of his hand in hers, the way he always waited until she had spoken before offering his own words. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold, they walked together to the ridge overlooking the valley. The river glittered below, winding like a silver thread through the cottonwoods. Clara stood quietly, her shawl tugged by the breeze. Then, gathering her courage, she turned to him. "When we married, I thought my life was over." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "I was afraid. I didn't know you. I didn't want this life. But now," she swallowed, her heart pounding, "now I can't imagine being anywhere else. With anyone else." Tahu studied her, his dark eyes shining with something unspoken. Then slowly he reached for her hand and pressed it against his chest. "My heart," he said simply. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun dipped below the horizon. In that moment, the world seemed to still, the river, the wind, the endless sky. What had begun as a forced union, born of fear and duty, had blossomed into love deeper than either of them had imagined. Clara had not expected it. She had not sought it, but here it was, as undeniable as the stars that emerged one by one above them. Her first night had begun with a whisper, "I'll be gentle." Now, many nights later, she knew the truth. Tao had given her more than gentleness.
He had given her love, and in return she had given him her heart.